This is the first of probably 6 or 7 videos on depression and New Deal. I'm dealing with the Dust Bowl today. If you go to the PowerPoints, the file that says depression, I will be covering visually the first 5 slides and then 8, 9, and 10 as well. I didn't arrange them for doing them remotely, but we'll do the best we can. The Dust Bowl is the other half of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, the stock market crashed, the whole economy tanked in October of 1929. The Dust Bowl, which is a natural disaster, probably one of the greatest natural disasters America faced before coronavirus, and it's been brought up a lot recently in the news, is a combination of natural disaster and man-made causes, but it happens almost simultaneously with the stock market crash. What happened was Southern Plains, America, as we know in Texas, parts of America have cycles of drought and rain. Southern Plains never had much rain. They are west of the 100th meridian, so they have always less than 25 inches of rain. Many parts of North Texas, and this is a very Texas thing, the northern third of Texas, usually got 16 inches of rain. That was the average. That's why Native Americans really didn't even live here. They hunted buffalo here, but they had never even the Comanche did not settle there. Old-time ranchers knew. They had experience. They had almost lost or lost their entire herds at different times, and they said, you can't farm out here. But the teens in the 1920s were wet years. They had average rainfall, 25 to 30 inches a year. You can grow wheat with that, so farmers came out. In addition, the U.S. government was subsidizing wheat for World War I and after World War I. So for a long time, you can make $2 a bushel on wheat. The response was, of course, if you had a small farm of 300 acres, you could make $6,000. These are people who basically before this made $500 a year, and now for the first time they could make big money. Their immediate response is, let me borrow some money, let me get a bigger tractor, let me buy more land. Next year I can make $10,000 or $15,000. Worked out fine. They did make good money until the drought begins. In the fall of 1931, spring of 1932, the rains stopped coming. And they stopped coming for 10 years. The average rainfall in that part of the Dust Bowl was average 16 inches. 1930s, usually 10 inches or less, sometimes 6 or 8 inches a year. Nothing grows. In addition to the drought, there were heat waves of 118 degrees Fahrenheit air temperature. One farmer took a thermometer out to his fields, put the thermometer on ground level, and found that the temperature at the base of his plants was 142 degrees. Anything that did grow, basically the heat cooked it. Because there's no air conditioning, you have to remember, doesn't come around till 1950. What happened, of course, is people died of heat stroke, heat exhaustion. In 1935, over 5,000 people died in that year alone. On top of this, because of the environmental conditions, plagues of rabbits, plagues of grasshoppers. These people actually thought, like the Old Testament, God had cursed them. They had done something wrong and they were doomed. Besides the overproduction, 11 million acres, more than that even later. There was a philosophy at the time, which is why we need science. The philosophy at the time was rain follows the plow. And I'm quoting a farmer here. God never wanted any part of the earth to be a permanent desert. If man would farm the land, God would provide the rain. They actually believed that if you planted crops, if trees were planted, they would draw rain from the rain clouds like a magnet. Didn't work out that way. The slide that shows the United States map with a lot of black areas, the black areas are eroded land, and you can see a big concentration of that in the southern plains in North Texas. So where did these dust storms come from? Because there was nothing holding the soil down, because the original prairie grasses had been torn up, had been plowed up, because the crops weren't growing, the dirt was loose on the ground. If you've ever driven across North Texas, you know the wind never stops blowing. So the wind kept blowing, anything from 20 miles an hour, sometimes up to 60 miles an hour, which is a grade 1 hurricane. The winds picked up the loose soil, picked it up, made it into a huge boiling, rolling dust cloud, as one guy described it in the documentary, like a horizontal tornado, sometimes miles tall in the air, sometimes 200 miles across. You saw one coming, there was no place to go. You could not outrun it. You could not get away from it. Blew across the southern plains, kept blowing east. In Texas, you'll notice the winds blow always west to east. And during the 1930s, ships out in the Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles out to sea, would find a film of dust on the ship's decks that came from Oklahoma and North Texas. Dust storms often lasted 24 hours. They were called black blizzards. When it snowed, it was black snow on top of it. 70 days in 1933, 30 consecutive days in 1935. Amarillo recorded close to 1,000 hours of dust storms in 1937. As the Depression continues, as the drought continues, the storms get worse and worse because there's less and less holding the soil down. And you can't imagine how bad these storms were. The documentary does a good job of describing it. But if you're a northerner or you've ever been through a severe blizzard in the north, it's the same thing, only black. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. You have no idea what is going on. You have no idea where you're going. What happened to the Great Plains was an environmental disaster, and largely a man-made environmental disaster. Single storm would pick up and drop 3 inches of dust. Scientists have figured out that per acre, probably close to 500 tons of topsoil was lost per acre. So you are talking hundreds of millions of tons per year being moved around and removed from the southern plains. Some immediate effects of the southern plains, and we'll talk about more later in subsequent videos. First of all, it turned into a near desert. On the southern plains, because there isn't very dense vegetation other than grasses, to create an inch of topsoil takes about 1,000 years. So they are losing inches in a year. If you drive through North Texas today, it is much more barren than it was when, say, the Spanish first arrived. They rode across that area and described grass as tall as the tops of their stirrups on the horses riding horseback. That doesn't happen in North Texas today. It won't happen for tens and tens of thousands of years, probably 1 million years, because there's no soil. It takes so long to create the soil there. Clouds of dust, crushed buildings, toppled telephone poles, destroyed houses, stopped trains because there were drifts of dust and the trains couldn't run. What happened to livestock, of course, is first of all, there's drought. There's nothing for them to eat. Number two, even when there were things to eat, they basically died of dust pneumonia. Dust filled their lungs, very fine dust. We call it silicosis today, the same thing as miner's black lung. And there's no grass for them to eat anyway. Farmers couldn't bring them in. There were too many. Their system filled up with dirt. They autopsied cattle and found their entire digestive system and their esophagus coated with mud. In the hill country in Texas, I know I've talked to old ranchers who survived through the 1930s, years ago, and what they did here, we didn't have the dust storms because it wasn't a prairie, an open prairie, but they would take torches and burn the spines off a prickly pear and feed that to their cattle because there wasn't any vegetation here either. This was a national drought, but particularly severe in the northern third of Texas. Crops disappeared. You basically could grow almost nothing. It wasn't worth the money to buy the seed to grow or the equipment to grow it. And farmers ended up just burning wheat in their stoves for fuel because there was no market for it. Dust pneumonia. People breathe this stuff and could not clear their lungs, basically. The same effects as silicosis or black lung in miners today. Remember, this is accumulated effects over a number of years, over 7 or 8 years. Particularly young kids, particularly the elderly, could not deal with it and died in much higher numbers. Even strong adults. The survivors, if you survived the dust storms, you had lung problems the rest of your life. Many people did not survive. Many parents tried to send their kids to relatives out of state just to get them out of the Dust Bowl. Great story in southern Oklahoma, western Oklahoma, of a young man who comes into his doctor and he's coughing and he's coughing. He says, "Doctor, I've been coughing for weeks. I cannot seem to clear my lungs." The doctor examined him, turned around and said, "Young man, you are full of dirt." And he died the next day. This is a healthy, young 20-year-old guy. So you can imagine the effect on young kids and on older people who are not physically as strong. Again, coronavirus is a direct connection here as well, although it doesn't hit young people. So that is a quick synopsis of the Dust Bowl, although Ken Burns' documentary does a much better job with much better visuals, obviously. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the direct effects of the economic collapse and then move on to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Thanks, and stay safe.